While almost everyone knows Hacker is the best dodge deck, there aren't that many people who are aware exactly why Sicario is the second best. Even people who have played the game for years can't often tell. Some people are aware it is, others fall into the trap thinking Rogue is the better one because on paper its base dodge is higher and there's nothing going on in the deck, so its simplicity is attractive for newer players or those still learning the game. Mathematically and practically however, Rogue doesn't really come close to the other two decks, and you'll be able to easily tell why after watching this video. I will be comparing each of these decks when being used at their peak, which means that each deck will have optimal skills and equipment such as first aid kits, converts where necessary, and Sneaky Bastard. For the fun of it, I've allowed Sicario to not have Sneaky Bastard, to give Rogue a bit of a chance to compete with Sicario. Although we'll learn later that this doesn't change much. I'll also be adding Sicario with flashes in this comparison, as I'm aware of a small portion of the community using this setup and find this setup somehow more effective than normal Sicario. I want to note that I'll be ranking these decks by comparing the amount of risk these decks can take with the mechanics they have. There's no point comparing the decks in scenarios where you wait for fade until there are no cops, play with a stacked team, or kill all cops before leaving cover, because we would be unable to see the boundaries that these decks can push, and any deck can stay in cover and clear space. It's important to understand the raw dodge numbers that each of these decks bring and then compare what they mean in more practical scenarios. Looking at numbers alone, Rogue maintains a base dodge of 60%, which becomes 70% by sprinting. Sicario is a bit more complicated. The deck has 20% base dodge, which becomes 30% by sprinting. But because of Twitch, the deck gains 20% dodge if hit, which is reset if the next shot is a dodge. So it would be very difficult to compare the raw numbers that Sicario has with the other decks. However, we can make it a bit simpler. There are many dodge tracker mods that can inform us how many shots were dodged throughout an entire game, out of the total number of shots that we receive. If we look at Rogue, the total number of shots dodged in a game falls between 60 to 70% of all shots. Looking at Sicario, we would see that Sicario dodges an average of 45% of shots a game, and this alone is typically enough for people to say that Rogue is outright better than Sicario. However, this 45% doesn't do justice to the mechanics that Sicario has to offer. You have to remember that this value is for the number of shots that are dodged throughout the entire game, which means that the amount of times dodged in the smoke during 10-second pockets of time in a heist isn't reflected well in the 45% that the mod shows. I tested the total number of shots that are dodged while only in the smoke on a mod called Proving Grounds, using both Sneaky Bastard and non-Sneaky Bastard setups. So it seems that when standing still, Sicario is marginally better than Rogue while in the smoke. But this is not where it ends for the deck. Sicario has a perk called Agility Shield, which allows the deck to replenish its armor if it dodges while having no armor. If I were to perform the exact same test on Rogue and Hacker, once their armor is broken from an undodged shot, they would be under armor suppression, rendering these decks incapable of recovering armor and therefore making them vulnerable to health damage. Sicario is better in this aspect as dodging a shot replenishes its armor. So even if Sicario takes more damage, very few of them would actually be health damage. 70% with Rogue is very different to 70% with Sicario, as in order for Sicario to take any health damage at all, it would have to take at least 2 undodged shots in a row, which, if in the smoke, would be extremely rare. In addition, the power of Agility Shield is exponential, as a higher dodge value means that Agility Shield would activate more frequently, giving the player much greater survivability. What we could conclude here is that the smoke offers pretty consistent results and survivability, and that in situations where we have to stay still, looking at effective dodge alone, Sicario is far superior to Rogue. As we all know, this game isn't about spending time looking at numbers in order to flex skill. So what does all this mean when looking at ideal gameplay? Let's look at Sicario with concussion grenades first. If we compare this with normal Sicario, you can throw multiple flashbangs to reliably do one objective, which in some cases could yield a better result than the smoke. However, this is the only strength of this setup, and it can also fall as a weakness. With only 6 flashes, you have to be very careful with how and when you're using them, and using multiple flashes to yield a result that's only almost as good as the smoke in the majority of cases, for only 1 to 2 times a heist, is not worth it at all. Especially as this also takes the slot of a much more powerful throwable in the smoke bomb. You could alternatively take ordnance bags to refill flashes to have more than enough for a single heist, but this also takes up a strong deployable in facts that are great for aggressive play, and similar to what was said before, refilling flashes to almost achieve the same result as the smoke is simply not worth it. Sicario by itself also doesn't have high dodge, making it pretty comparable to Burglar in that aspect, and would definitely make the deck much worse than Rogue overall. I'm almost convinced that those people who have spoken for Rogue's power over Sicario have only ever used the setup with Sicario, or don't even know how to use a smoke, which would explain a lot. This deck has some benefits if we compare it to Sicario. Rogue has a high base dodge, 60% when stationary and 70% while sprinting, making it better than Sicario without the smoke or when it has flashbangs. There's also the faster swap speed and the lesser chance of targeting, but in a practical setting, these don't really change the game much. There have been many so-called experienced players who look at Rogue's high base dodge and see it as enough to be better than Sicario. I'll get to Sicario soon, but while the high base dodge allows for pretty aggressive movement around the map, it's not a very important or game-changing form of aggressive play. Additionally, if surrounded by a team of inexperienced players, movement around the map will be pretty limited with the sheer number of cops, and doing an objective would be very difficult if not impossible. It's not worth comparing with decent to good teams as it doesn't highlight the full power of a deck as much. If a rogue player decided to rush an objective mid-assault with multiple cops shooting at them, the player would be lucky to have even survived. Rogue only needs about 3 shots until they're downed, but with that many cops shooting, the number of shots that are going to deal damage will be enough to down them. While interacting with an objective, Rogue would be subject to armor suppression with the number of shots towards it, and so you're pretty much rolling the die to hope that less than 3 of these shots would deal damage. It would be pretty easy to just say, just clear the space before doing the objective, but every optimal build is able to do that regardless of the perk deck, and we are comparing the level of risk that each of these decks can take and still survive reliably. One way to boost the survivability of Rogue would be with facts and concussion grenades, but as said before, rushing an objective like this is unreliable. Flashes are a common throwable that isn't unique to Rogue, and the use of multiple flashes can only get so close to the power of the smoke bomb, and here's why. Before we get to the power of the smoke, let's get the cons of normal Sicario out of the way. This deck is pretty hard to master when compared to other decks in this game, given that there are many variables to consider for a good smoke, so it's quite understandable that even experienced players would have difficulty with using this deck well. The base dodge is pretty low at around 20%, and so without the smoke bomb, it would definitely be worse than Rogue. The deck is also prone to certain bugs, the most common being desync, causing the smoke to delay its activation by a few seconds after the throwable was used. The cooldown of the smoke bomb might also give some trouble for inexperienced players and experienced players alike. However, if the smoke bomb is used well, along with continued aggressive play, the cooldown shouldn't be an issue. On paper, the cooldown is 60 seconds, but it actually starts from the moment the smoke bomb leaves your hand. Given that the duration of the smoke lasts 10 seconds, that's effectively 50 seconds of cooldown. A kill reduces the cooldown by a second, so if you are killing cops in the smoke or during its cooldown, assuming you get at least 10 kills per minute or more, that's an effective cooldown of 40 seconds or less, which isn't much of a downtime at all if you compare this to the overall length of the heist. Let's now talk about the smoke itself. The smoke allows for a level of aggressiveness that cannot be matched by Rogue. The most obvious example of this is in objectives. The smoke allows for the objective to be done very reliably, even during the assault and with a bad team. Unlike Rogue, Sicario does not suffer from armor suppression on dodge shots because of agility shield. As I said before, 2 undodged shots in a row are required to deal damage to Sicario's health. I'm no mathematician, but there's a much lower chance of that happening twice or 3 times than it is for Rogue to get at least 3 undodged shots. This makes Sicario very powerful for doing objectives, and you wouldn't have to wait long to do another one either. Add first aid kits to the smoke and you can pretty much rush the majority of objectives in the game. The smoke isn't just limited to objectives either, as it is very powerful in staying on the front lines and killing groups of cops. And believe it or not, even dozers. I don't even need to mention some of the other utility the deck brings to show that it's more powerful and useful than Rogue, but in case you forgot, the smoke can provide an additional 10% dodge as well as half the chance to be hit for teammates, as well as reducing cop accuracy by half, which makes this deck incredibly versatile. Rogue definitely has its place, but Sicario is far more powerful than it in the majority of situations. The smoke bomb is a powerful tool, and while it's not as active as Hacker's Pocket ECM or Kingpin's Injector for example, the utility the smoke brings makes it an incredibly strong A tier deck in the right hands. Rogue would sit a tier below, and Sicario with flashes another tier below that. That's it from me, and I'll see you in Payday 3.